The empath sits alone in a room that used to feel unbearable in silence. Months ago, maybe years ago, this quiet would have sent them spiraling, replaying conversations, dissecting what they did wrong, wondering if they were the monster after all. But something has shifted. The silence doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't feel empty. It feels like the first honest thing they've experienced in longer than they can remember. And that terrifies everyone around them more than the breakdown ever did. Carl Jung spent decades working with patients who had survived what he recognized as psychological annihilation at the hands of someone they loved. He watched these patients move through stages that looked like grief but weren't grief, that resembled depression but weren't depression, that appeared to be emotional shutdown but were actually something far more radical happening beneath the surface. Jung documented a final stage that most psychologists never witness because most survivors don't reach it. They get stuck in anger, in mourning, in the cycle of trying to understand what happened to them. But the ones who push through all of that arrive at a psychological state so fundamentally altered that Jung struggled to describe it without sounding like he was talking about a different species. What he eventually called it was the completed death. Not the death of the person, but the death of everything false that the abuse had been attached to. Every performance, every accommodation, every version of themselves they had constructed to survive someone else's pathology. All of it burned away. And what remained was someone the empath had never met before. Someone they'd been their entire life, but had never been allowed to become. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about this final stage, why it only happens after the empath has been through the specific devastation of narcissistic abuse, what psychological processes are actually occurring during this transformation, and why the person who emerges from this stage possesses a kind of power that makes them almost unrecognizable to everyone who knew them before. To understand the final stage, you have to understand what narcissistic abuse actually does to an empath's psychology. Not just the obvious damage, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the erosion of self-worth. Jung saw something deeper happening, something structural. The narcissist doesn't just hurt the empath, they colonize the empath's identity. Jung observed that narcissistic abusers systematically replace the empath's authentic self with a version that serves the abuser's needs. Over months or years, the empath's own desires, perceptions, boundaries, and identity get overwritten. The empath stops knowing what they feel because they've been trained to feel whatever keeps the narcissist stable. They stop knowing what they think because every thought has been filtered through. Will this upset them? They stop knowing who they are because the person they became in the relationship was engineered by someone else's pathology. This is why leaving isn't enough. You can remove yourself physically from a narcissist and still be psychologically occupied by them. The empath escapes the relationship, but carries the colonized identity with them. They're free in body, but still imprisoned in the psychological architecture the abuser built inside their mind. Jung found that this internal occupation was often more devastating than the abuse itself, because the empath couldn't locate themselves anymore. The person they were before the abuse felt like a stranger. The person they became during the abuse felt like a puppet. And they had no idea who they actually were underneath either version. This is the wasteland phase, the period after escape where the empath exists in a psychological no man's land. They're not who they were. They're not who the narcissist made them. They're nobody. And this terrifying emptiness is where most survivors get stuck, trying desperately to reconstruct an identity from the wreckage, grasping at who they used to be, attempting to go back to before. But Jung discovered that the empaths who reached the final stage did something radically different. They stopped trying to go back. They stopped trying to reconstruct the old self. They let the emptiness stay. And in that emptiness, something began to grow that had never had permission to exist before. Jung called this the shadow reclamation. During narcissistic abuse, the empath's shadow, every quality the abuser deemed unacceptable, gets buried even deeper than it was before. Anger gets suppressed because anger made the narcissist rage. Selfishness gets eliminated because any self-focus was labeled as cruelty. Boundaries get dissolved because boundaries triggered punishment. The empath's shadow doesn't just get ignored during abuse, it gets systematically annihilated. But shadows don't die. They go underground, they compress, they wait. And in the wasteland phase after abuse, when every false structure has collapsed and the empath has nothing left to perform, the shadow begins to surface with a force that's almost volcanic. This is what confuses therapists and friends and family. The empath who was always accommodating suddenly has opinions that cut like glass. The person who never said no starts saying it without explanation or apology. The individual who absorbed everyone's emotions begins refusing to carry what isn't theirs, and the people around them interpret this as damage from the abuse. They think the empath is becoming bitter, cold, selfish. They want the old empath back, the soft one, the accommodating one, the one who made everyone comfortable. But Jung recognized that the old empath was the problem. The softness wasn't health, it was a wound. The accommodation wasn't virtue, it was survival. The emotional absorption wasn't empathy. It was a trauma response that predated the narcissistic relationship by decades. The abuse didn't create the empath's dysfunction. It exploited dysfunction that was already there. And the final stage is when the empath finally faces that unbearable truth. This is the moment most survivors avoid at all costs, because it's one thing to recognize the narcissist's cruelty. That's painful, but manageable. You can direct your grief and rage outward. It's another thing entirely to recognize your own participation. Not your fault. Jung was adamant about that distinction, but your participation, the patterns that made you available for exploitation, the wounds that made you confuse abuse with love, the identity structures that made you believe your worth depended on being needed by someone who was destroying you. Jung documented that empaths in the final stage went through what he described as a second devastation. The first devastation was recognizing what the narcissist did to them. The second was recognizing what they'd been doing to themselves long before the narcissist arrived. The compulsive caretaking that made them ignore their own needs. The boundary dissolution that they'd been practicing since childhood. The deep, aching belief that they had to earn love through service because they weren't worthy of love just for existing. The narcissist didn't plant these patterns. They found them already growing and exploited them perfectly. And in the final stage, the empath sees this with devastating clarity. They see how the relationship was a magnified version of dynamics they'd been living their entire life. How they chose partners, friends, and situations that replicated the original wound. How their empathy, the thing they were most proud of, had been functioning as a sophisticated defense mechanism against facing their own pain. This recognition doesn't feel like insight. It feels like standing in a burning building and realizing you built the structure yourself. Every timber, Every wall, you assembled the architecture of your own suffering, and then someone came along and lit the match. Understanding this is excruciating, but Jung found it was the doorway to genuine transformation, because it shifted the empath from victim to author. Not author of the abuse, never that, but author of the patterns that made them vulnerable. And if you authored those patterns, you can write different ones. The shadow material that surfaces during this stage is fierce. Rage at the narcissist, yes, but also rage at themselves for staying so long. Grief for the years lost, yes, but also grief for the self they abandoned long before the narcissist demanded it. Shame about what they tolerated, yes, but also shame about how they used caretaking to avoid their own inner work. These emotions don't arrive gently. They arrive like a storm that's been building behind a dam for decades, and the dam just broke. Jung found that empaths who tried to manage this storm, who tried to process it neatly, therapeutically, in measured doses, often got stuck in it indefinitely. The ones who reached the final stage let the storm happen. They didn't try to control it or understand it prematurely. They let the rage burn, let the grief drown them, let the shame strip them bare. They trusted that what was being destroyed needed destroying, and they waited for what would remain when the fire finally went out. And something did remain. Jung described it as the essential self, the psychological core that exists beneath every persona, every performance, every accommodation, every trauma response. The self that was present before the first wound was inflicted, before the first adaptation was made, before the child learned to read the room instead of being in the room. This essential self had been buried under so many layers of survival strategy that the empath had never experienced it consciously. But when everything else burned away, the people-pleasing, the compulsive helping, the boundary-less merging with others, what was left was someone startlingly real. If you've been sitting in this fire, if what I'm describing feels less like a script and more like a mirror, then you already know this process can't be rushed, only trusted. Our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built for exactly this kind of inner excavation. It won't hand you easy answers because there aren't any, but it will give you honest questions, the kind that help you find your way within when everything familiar has burned to the ground. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, because what Jung documented about the person who emerges from this final stage is remarkable. They don't become cold, they become clear. There's a difference that most people can't perceive from the outside, but that fundamentally changes everything about how the empath moves through the world. Before the abuse, the empath felt everyone's pain and believed it was their responsibility to alleviate it. After the final stage, the empath perceives everyone's pain with precision, but no longer confuses perception with obligation. They can see someone's wound without volunteering to heal it. They can recognize someone's suffering without absorbing it into their own body. They can have compassion without losing themselves inside it. Jung called this boundaried perception, the ability to see clearly without being consumed by what you see, and he found it only developed in empaths who had been through the specific devastation of narcissistic abuse and come out the other side. Not because the abuse was good for them, never that, but because the abuse destroyed the very structures that had made their empathy dysfunctional. It forced a dismantling that the empath would never have chosen voluntarily, and from that dismantling, a healthier architecture emerged. The empath in the final stage develops what Jung described as psychological sovereignty. They are no longer available for colonization because there's no empty space to colonize. The void that the narcissist exploited, the empath's uncertain identity, their desperate need to be needed, their willingness to abandon themselves for connection, has been filled by the essential self. There's someone home now, someone who knows who they are, what they'll accept, and what they refuse to tolerate. Not because they read it in a book about boundaries, because they learned it through fire. This sovereignty manifests in ways that unsettle people who knew the empath before. The empath stops explaining themselves, not out of coldness, out of completeness. They no longer need external validation to confirm their reality. They know what happened. They know what they feel. They know what they'll accept. And that knowing doesn't require anyone else's agreement to be real. They also develop an almost unsettling ability to detect inauthenticity. Having been immersed in deception for so long, having had their reality systematically dismantled by someone who weaponized closeness, the empath in the final stage can recognize performance instantly. They see the manipulation before it lands, feel the love bombing before it hooks, sense the false self before it's revealed. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition refined through devastating experience, and it makes them nearly impossible to deceive again. Jung observed that this perceptual sharpness extended beyond romantic relationships. Empaths in the final stage began recognizing narcissistic dynamics everywhere, in friendships, family systems, workplaces, even spiritual communities. They saw how the same patterns of exploitation and accommodation played out across every domain of human interaction, and this seeing changed who they could tolerate being around. The social circle of an empath in the final stage typically shrinks dramatically, not because they've become antisocial, because they've become honest. They can no longer maintain relationships built on performance and accommodation. They can no longer pretend that surface-level connection is satisfying. They need relationships where both people are real, where the masks are down, where the wounds are acknowledged, where love doesn't require the erasure of self. And those relationships are rare, so the empath's world gets smaller. But what remains in that smaller world is more genuine than anything they experienced before. Jung noted something else about empaths who completed this stage. They developed a relationship with solitude that looked unhealthy to outsiders, but was actually the healthiest thing about them. They could be alone without being lonely, could sit in silence without spiraling, could spend time with themselves and find the company satisfying. This wasn't avoidance or isolation. It was the result of finally having a self-worth spending time with. When you've lived your entire life focused on everyone else's interior world, discovering your own is almost intoxicating. But Jung also warned about a specific danger in the final stage. Some empaths, having discovered the power of boundaries and the relief of detachment, overcorrected. They became so protective of their inner world that they shut down completely. They confused sovereignty with fortress, clarity with coldness, discernment with disconnection. And they ended up as isolated as they had been enmeshed, just on the opposite end of the spectrum. Jung emphasized that genuine individuation, his term for becoming psychologically whole, wasn't about swinging from one extreme to the other. It was about integration. The empath in the final stage needed to integrate their newfound strength with their inherent sensitivity, to be both boundaried and compassionate, both discerning and open, both sovereign and connected. This integration was the actual completion of the stage, not the detachment itself, but the ability to re-engage with life from a place of wholeness rather than wound. The empath who achieves this integration becomes something genuinely rare. They possess the sensitivity they were born with, refined by the shadow material they have integrated, protected by the boundaries forged in devastation, and grounded in an identity that no one else constructed for them. They can love without losing themselves, help without depleting themselves, connect without abandoning themselves, and see clearly without being destroyed by what they see. Jung found that these individuals often became natural healers, not in the compulsive, self-sacrificing way they had operated before, but in a grounded, sovereign way. They could hold space for others' pain without absorbing it, could offer insight without needing it to be received, could witness suffering without feeling responsible for ending it. Their empathy had been transformed from wound into instrument, something they wielded consciously rather than something that wielded them. This is the final stage Jung documented. Not recovery, not returning to who you were before the abuse, but becoming someone you've never been. Someone who couldn't exist without the devastation that preceded them. The narcissistic abuse didn't make you stronger in some toxic positivity sense. It destroyed the false structures you'd been living inside. And from those ruins, something authentic finally had room to grow. If you're in this process right now, if you're somewhere between the wasteland and the emergence, between the burning and the rebuilding, Jung would tell you that you're not broken. You're being forged. The confusion isn't pathology. It's the disorientation of becoming someone genuinely new. The emptiness isn't depression. It's the space that opens when everything false finally falls away. And the person on the other side of this transformation is someone worth becoming, not in spite of what you endured, but because what you endured burned away everything that was never truly yours and left only what is. That's the final stage, not a return, a arrival. Arriving at yourself for the first time after a lifetime of living as someone else's construction. And if you're standing in that arrival right now, uncertain and raw and more real than you've ever been, you're exactly where Jung said you'd be. The final stage doesn't feel like victory. It feels like truth. And truth, after years of performing inside someone else's distorted reality, is the most disorienting freedom you'll ever experience. If this stage feels like the beginning of something you can't yet name, if you're ready to meet the person emerging from the wreckage, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for this exact threshold. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed not to tell you who you are, but to help you finally hear your own answer. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.